Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special Talking Insomnia episode. We have Nick Wignall with us. Welcome back, Nick.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm glad to be here.
Super glad you're here. And for anyone who doesn't know Nick, I want to say that Nick actually, you actually told me about like set it and forget it in the context of insomnia, which made me like choose that for title of my book. And also, I remember one of the episodes we made together. Somebody had trouble sleeping, but were doing better, and they were asking like, "How can I prevent myself from having insomnia again?" And you said something I never forget. You said something like,
Hmm.
"You have to be willing to have insomnia," and that just struck me. And like from now, I say that all the time: be willing to experience anxiety. So I learned so much from you. So I'm so glad you're back again, Nick.
Oh, ditto. I mean, I feel like it's been fun over the years. We both have been picking each other's brains and learning a lot. So
Yeah.
let's get into it.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, the plan for today is to go over an article you wrote, really nice article, 8 traits of emotionally intelligent people. And I think these traits can help not only with like general peace of mind, but peaceful sleep. So we'll contextualize these for insomnia as well. Sounds good?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. So I've done something I almost never do, which is I really prepared. I wrote down things here on a piece of paper.
Uh
So
oh.
anyway,
Daniel's
first one.
preparing.
Let's go. Let's do the first one.
Sure.
See your emotions as messengers, not viruses. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, so I have to say I was using this metaphor before the most recent big virus hit us all over the last few years. So it's it's not meant to be applicable to that specifically. But yeah, I mean, I guess the big idea here is that it's natural when something is painful. It's very natural for us to think of it as bad and to avoid it, right? And so a lot of emotions can get to the point where they're pretty uncomfortable, even painful, right? Think about being anxious or being sad or feeling ashamed, or there's all these things that they feel pain. They're kind of psychically painful, and so our instinct, is to avoid stuff that's painful. The problem is, in general, when it comes to human psychology, if you habitually start avoiding, running away from something, that sends the message to your brain that that thing is bad, right? Because it's like fight or flight, right? The more you run away from something, your brain's going, oh, that thing must be dangerous, which means your brain is going to be more on the lookout for that. It's going to be more sensitive to that thing in the future. And if it encounters that thing in the future, it's going to put you into fight or flight faster. It's going to make you anxious, right? Because it's trying to keep you safe. It thinks that thing is dangerous. So if you think about this in the context of emotions, right? If I feel anxious, but then I go, oh my God, I'm anxious. Like I got to do something to get rid of it, right? You might, if you start doing a breathing exercise real quick, or you distract yourself, or you take a shot of whiskey, or whatever it is, you might temporarily feel less anxious. The problem, though, is long term, you're teaching your brain that anxiety is dangerous, that it's a threat, right? Which, and what happens long term, the next time something pops up that stimulates a little anxiety, it's going to make you're going to feel anxious about being anxious. And anytime you compound difficult emotions, it makes them way more intense and long lasting. So I always say, like, compounding emotions are multiplicative, not additive. So if you have
Yeah.
5 units of anxiety and you add another 5 units of anxiety, you're not getting 10 units, you're getting 25 units, right? So when you're afraid of being afraid, you get really afraid.
Yeah.
So that's why, even though our emotions are like messengers, they're our brain telling us like, hey, we think something's dangerous. They don't know for sure. Your emotions aren't infallible. They're often wrong, right? But they're well intentioned. They're saying, hey, we think this thing is dangerous. You should prepare for it, right? That's the message. You might not like hearing the message, right? But that doesn't mean the message itself is bad. Or to put it in simpler terms, if you put your hand on a hot stove, right, and there's a burning pain, right, is the pain bad?
No,
No,
it's
right?
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, your skin burning, tissue damage is bad. That's dangerous. The pain signal, while uncomfortable, is actually a really good thing. So this idea of seeing your emotions as messengers, not viruses, what that means is even if you don't like the emotion, even if you don't like the message your emotion is sending you, it's uncomfortable, it's painful. That doesn't mean it's bad, right? And so that's where you really it's a difficult distinction to make, but it's really important that just because something feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. And so learning to see your emotions as messengers, not viruses, that's my little way of trying to help people remember to make that distinction in the moment.
Yeah. Very, very nicely said. Let me ask you a follow-up question, and this is something I ponder sometimes. Can an emotion ever be wrong?
I don't think so. So to me, the way you might have to ask a professional philosopher about this, but here's my way of thinking about this. Wrong is a moral judgment, right? When we say someone's wrong or something's bad or something's evil or whatever, we're saying it's a moral judgment. Now, as far as I know, I've never encountered any sort of moral or ethical system in the world that would say you can be morally accountable for something you don't have any control over. Right? So like no one gets sent to prison for feeling really angry.
Right.
You go to prison because you act on your anger and you do something bad, right? But the anger itself is not bad. So emotion, we don't have direct control over our emotions. And because you can't control it directly, to me, that means it's not something we should judge as morally good or bad. It might be painful or pleasant, right? It might be, it might be difficult, it might be whatever, but it's not good or bad. It's just not a very helpful way of thinking about emotions, I don't think.
Yeah, very, very nicely said. And yeah, I've pondered something similar that, an emotion, as you said, is just a message. And it's just kind of like our brain has interpreted some circumstances in a way, since it's a message. So although it doesn't feel good, it's never like a thought or an emotion I think also can never be wrong, actually. It's just very nicely put. And just to contextualize this for insomnia, I would say my thinking here is that like the predominant emotion when it comes to insomnia is anxiety. So looking at anxiety as a message, the brain telling us that, oh, something is wrong, maybe there's some danger, but just kind of like stepping out of that, seeing it as a message can be really helpful, right?
Yeah. And not only emotions, but I think another thing that comes up a lot with anxiety is worry, which is sort of the mental, it's the mental behavior that leads to anxiety. But a worry can just pop into your mind like, oh my God, what if I only sleep 3 hours tonight?
Yes.
Right. That also, you want to be careful of not getting judgmental or getting into sort of this is good, this is bad, that this worry popped into my mind, right? Because once you start worrying about having worries, now you're really feeling a lot of anxiety, right? And then you're gonna have a much harder time falling asleep and staying asleep, right? So I think this applies not just to emotions, but to really any experience, that we don't have direct control over. Thoughts pop into our mind. It's not something we can control. It's not good or bad. It's our brain trying to help us, even whether it's helpful or not. It's well intentioned, right? And so you want to be careful of having these kind of knee jerk judgments about these things, like non-deliberative thinking, or like a worry popping into your head, or an emotion like anxiety. It's very difficult, but you really want to try and be above your thoughts and emotions, not in them. And when we're judging them and even analyzing them, we're in them, right? We want to be observing them with perspective, I think.
Makes 100% sense. And before we go to number 2 here, I just have to ask you something that I'm pondering so much lately, and it's this. I remember you said actually that I think the first time we did an episode together, you said that insomnia, the way you look at it, is not a sleep disorder. And when you look at, which makes total sense, when you look at like the definition of insomnia, it just says something like, if you have trouble sleeping more than 3 nights, it doesn't say anything about why it's happening. But then if you look at the definition of like a phobia, then to me it becomes really interesting, because like the nature of a phobia is like we're scared of something, and the more we try to avoid that, the more the fear grows of it. So, and also like I think the most common way to meet a phobia is like exposure therapy, expose ourselves to what we've been scared of. And I'm like, insomnia, couldn't that be defined as more of a phobia? What do you think of that?
I think that's often the case with insomnia. Yeah, is that people are afraid of not sleeping. They're afraid of the consequences of not sleeping, and this turns into a vicious cycle, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You spend all this time thinking about how you're not going to sleep, and then you end up not sleeping because you're super anxious and tightly wound, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think so. One of the, probably, I would say in my experience, by far the most effective technique for working through insomnia is what's variously called sleep restriction, or time in bed restriction, or sleep compression. There's all these terms for it, which basically means you confine your time in bed to what's less than you would normally get. And the idea is that you prioritize kind of getting quality sleep over just sort of quantity of time in bed. And once you start getting consistently good sleep, you gradually expand it back out again to your optimal amount of time, whatever that is, right? So that, I'm sure your audience has listened to you talk about that, and I know you do that a lot. But what I think is an underappreciated, and this gets to your question about phobias, I think one of the reasons that's so effective, one of the kind of hidden mechanisms or kind of like active ingredients in that technique is it's a form of exposure therapy. You're showing people I can deliberately choose to only get 5 or 6 hours of sleep per night. And it's rough, it's not great, but like I don't die. Nothing terrible happens, right? And when you do that consistently and willingly, what you build a tremendous amount of confidence in yourself that like, yeah, you know what? Sometimes sleep's not great and like it's a bummer, but it's not the end of the world. Like nothing terrible happens. I don't die, nothing breaks, right? My capacity to sleep doesn't change. And so it's like doing exposure therapy for any other kind of anxiety issue.
Yeah.
Nobody ever talks about it like that, but I think that's one of the reasons why it's so effective. It's working on multiple levels, and that's one of the more underappreciated ones.
Yeah, no, so well said, and that's exactly what I think too. I think in the traditional kind of CBT-I world, it's it's taught as like, oh, you have to build a really strong sleep drive. That part I don't think is at all as important as what you said. That is kind of the willingness to expose ourselves to what we've been afraid of, sleeping less. And
Yeah.
well said. All right, let's jump to number 2 here. Listen to your emotions, but don't trust them.
Yeah, how often you hear a psychologist telling you to stop trusting your emotions? Now, part of this I think is semantics. Like, what do we mean by trusting our emotions versus listening to them? So this is the way I think about it is, I think historically we have gotten to the point where we know that ignoring your emotions is not a great idea, right? If you just are completely ignore your emotions or discount them or never listen to them like that, you're gonna get in all sorts of trouble doing that, right? And I think as a culture, as a field, like we understand that really well. In fact, I think we understand it so well that we sort of unintentionally swing to the other extreme where we put emotions like up on a pedestal. Like they're these incredible things that contain all this like deep wisdom, and like we should be sort of like, orienting our whole lives around our emotions. And that like whatever our emotions are telling us or kind of pushing us to do, we should trust that and go with that. I think that's just as misguided as ignoring your emotions, because while your emotions might always be trying to help, I think that's true. I think your emotions are always, and we're kind of anthropomorphizing here, but they're like a friend or an advisor who's trying to help you see something or do something important. But just like a really well-intentioned friend, sometimes their advice might be really good, but sometimes they might have no idea what they're talking about, right? Or they could think they know what they're talking about, but it just doesn't apply very well to you in this particular situation, right? So if you're in the middle of a meeting, right, at work, and you're thinking, okay, yeah, I have this great idea, I should mention it, and then a part of your brain pipes up and goes, no, like people are going to think that's stupid, and you feel anxious. That anxiety is pushing you to not say something. Now, is that a good idea? I don't know. Maybe you can imagine situations where maybe it's not a good idea, but maybe that's a terrible idea. Maybe you should say that thing even though you feel anxious, right? So I think it's always a good idea to listen to your emotions, but you shouldn't be afraid to say, thanks, but no thanks. I'm going to go and do this anyway. I hear you, but I don't think that's really applicable in this situation. So I'm just trying to, when I say listen to your emotions, but don't trust them, I'm trying to strike the balance between being aware of and sort of understanding of your emotions, but also not being sort of like slavishly passive and just sort of going with whatever they tell you to do. Both are equally problematic, I think. We can talk about why, but what I'm arguing for is like a middle ground of being aware of and listening compassionately to your emotions, but not taking orders either.
Yeah, very nicely said. And let's contextualize that for insomnia, and then we can go from there. Yep. So the thing that popped into my mind as we were talking about this was, people with insomnia often become afraid of doing things in the evening that they think may lead to not sleeping. For example, like socializing. So a message can be like, oh, I feel like going out with my friends, but oh no, that's making me anxious. My brain's telling me like, don't do that. So in this scenario, like, how do you contextualize this with what you just said?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, like, I think fear comes up a lot. So fear, anxiety comes up a lot with insomnia. And that's if you just take a little while to catalog all the places fear shows up around bedtime and sleep and all that sort of thing, it's worth asking, okay, fear is telling me something. It's sending me a message, right? Now, is that message actually helpful, or is it, understandable, but not actually aligned with what I know to be true, what I know to be helpful? All the wisdom Daniel has imparted to me in our coaching sessions, is it really aligned with that, right? And if it's not, right, If your mind is saying like, oh, like if I don't get into bed now, I'm not going to have my full 8 hours of sleep, and then tomorrow's going to be a disaster. And like, is that true? Or are you better off saying, you know what? Even if I got 6 hours of really good sleep, if I waited to get into bed until I was actually sleepy so that I could get good quality sleep, admittedly for less time, I'll probably be better off tomorrow. And I'll certainly be in a better place to get my sleep back on track long term. So thank you, anxiety. Like it's an interesting concern, and I appreciate you letting me know. But actually, we're going to go in a different direction today.
Exactly. Okay, very nicely. So let's go to number 3. Talk about your emotions in plain language. What does this mean?
Yes. So I think a problem all of us fall into is that we intellectualize our emotions. What this means is you've had for example, you've had a super rough day at work, and you come home and your spouse or your partner says, what's wrong? Are you okay? They can kind of tell by your face that like something's up, right? And you say, no, I'm just kind of stressed, right? That is what I would call an intellectualized emotion. You've got a lot of emotions going on. Maybe you're nervous because you screwed up a big presentation, right? And you're worried about getting fired or something. So you're anxious, you're afraid, right? But here's the thing. If you think about it, most adults don't walk around saying things like, I'm afraid, I'm sad, I'm angry. In fact, you hear that and you're like, that sounds like a 6-year-old. Like, that's what a kid says, right? And the reason we do that, the reason we intellectualize how we feel, we use like vague conceptual words like stressed, right? Or we use metaphors like, oh, I'm just really bugged right now. No, you're not bugged, you're angry. Like, you're mad. Like, let's call a spade, right? But the reason we do that is because it's a subtle but powerful form of avoidance, right? If you were to actually say, I'm afraid, you're gonna feel worse. It's gonna feel painful to admit that you're actually afraid, right? But when you say, oh, I'm stressed, you like put some distance on it. It doesn't feel as real, as concrete, right? And so while in the moment it feels better to intellectualize those things and kind of avoid them, we fall back into that trap we talked about earlier, which is when you run away from something, what you're teaching your brain is, hey, this thing's bad. So the next time you feel afraid, you're going to feel even more afraid or ashamed or mad about feeling afraid. And it's going to be even harder to acknowledge it plainly. So if you want to build kind of a healthier relationship with your emotions so that you're less reactive to them long term, a really important habit is to start talking about your emotions either to yourself in your own head or out loud to other people. Both are important, right? Talk about them in very plain language. And the little like mantra I use is say it like a 6-year-old. If a 6-year-old me was feeling this right now, what would I say? Would I say I'm overwhelmed? No, I would say I'm afraid, right? Or if I'm, would I say that I'm like pissed off? No, like a 6-year-old's not going to like, they don't have all these fancy metaphors. They just say, I'm mad, right? I'm afraid. So what you're doing there is you're approaching those emotions, however difficult. And what that is signaling to your brain is this thing's difficult, but it's not bad. It's not a threat, right? So the next time it comes up, you're going to be less reactive to it and more able to deal with it in healthy language. And so in the context of insomnia, again, like fear is the big one that comes up here. Sometimes frustration and anger too. But it's really important to acknowledge and be honest about the role of how these difficult emotions show up in this struggle of insomnia. When I was working with people who had insomnia, they would tell me, all day long till they were blue in the face, oh no, I'm not anxious. I don't have an anxiety problem. Right? And they'd use words like, oh, I'm just really stressed, or I'm just, I'm kind of overwhelmed, or blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. But like, really, no, like they're anxious. They're afraid of not sleeping or what's going to happen if they don't sleep. And if you want to work through that in a healthy way, you got to be honest about where you are and really straightforward. So we could take that a bunch of different ways, but in general, whether it's insomnia or any other aspect of our life, one of the simplest but most powerful ways to start building a healthier relationship with your emotions is to talk about them, either to yourself or when appropriate to other people, in just really plain, straightforward language. Instead of using all these convoluted, kind of conceptual adult terms, just be straightforward.
Very, very nicely said. And what came to mind as we were talking here was another, the part about honesty here. And one thing I hear very often is something like, oh, I just have I just have a chemical imbalance. I just have some, like, there's something like, I just have this, probably I don't have enough of this neurotransmitter or something like that, which again, nothing here is medical advice, but to me, it's a sign of somebody who doesn't really want to just honestly say, I'm scared. And, just as you mentioned, somebody said I'm stressed instead of saying I'm scared. Now, another thought that I wanted to ask you about was, like, do you think the following, how true does this ring to you, that a reason we humans, we don't like to tell other people that I'm scared or I'm nervous, I'm angry, is that we're a pack animal, and if we want to be part of a tribe, that makes us feel safe. And if we think that something is sort of wrong with us, or other people would think so, we can feel like, I'm going to be outside of the pack, I'm not going to be in this kind of safe zone, and that's why we kind of shy away from this. Does that ring true to you?
Oh, I mean, totally. And I think there's some truth to that, honestly. Like, I actually, I don't think it's a good idea to go around like vomiting out to everyone you meet, like every little feeling that you have. Like, I mean, we go into the specifics of that, but like, I don't think that's a particularly healthy way to go through life anyway. So the point is, when it's appropriate, when it would be helpful, when it really matters to someone else, you want to have the capacity to express and talk about how you feel emotionally in straightforward terms. I think where it's more important is with yourself. When
Yeah.
you're talking to yourself, because what you really don't want to be doing is lying to yourself about how you feel. Lying's that's a little intense, but you don't want to be like even unintentionally dishonest about how you feel. Because ultimately, if you want to work through this stuff and you don't want to be as ruled by these difficult feelings anymore, like, you have to be clear about where you are, where you stand, if you want to start making progress in a better direction.
Yeah.
And I think that starts with something as simple as just, when you talk to yourself in your head about how you're feeling, be like, call a spade a spade. Be really straightforward about it. How would a 6-year-old say this?
Exactly. Nicely said. All right. Number 4, distinguish emotions from the thoughts that triggered them. Let's hear about this.
Yeah. So this is a huge one. This is a really common misconception, I think. And you see it, a classic example is, what's the difference between anxiety and worry? Worry is a thought, right? So it might be something like, oh my God, there's no way I'm going to sleep tonight. That's a worry, right? Anxiety is the emotion you feel as a result of certain forms of thinking and thoughts you say to yourself. So when you say, oh my God, I'm not going to sleep tonight, you're going to feel anxious as a result. Now, this is important because as uncomfortable as anxiety is, right, you cannot control anxiety. There's no button you can press to feel more or less anxious. There's no lever you can pull to feel more or less angry, right? We do not have direct control over our emotions. The only way we can influence them is indirectly through the way we think. Right? So if you're feeling really anxious and you don't want to feel so anxious anymore, maybe it's about sleep or anything else, you have to ask yourself, what do I actually have control over? Yes, I would like to not feel so anxious, but I can't do anything about that right now. What I can do is look at the thought processes that are contributing to that anxiety and work on those, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm caught in this cycle of worrying about all sorts of stuff, that is something you can control. However hard it is, right? You can, to a large extent, and there's some nuance here we'll talk about, but to a large extent, you can control and influence how you think, right? You can shift your attention and choose to think about something else. Now, it might get pulled back to more worries, but again, then you pull it right back again to whatever else it is. And I'm not saying this is easy. It's very hard in a lot of cases, but you can control your attention and what you choose to think about. And if you want to influence how you feel, that's where you should be spending your time and your energy. Now, the nuance I wanted to put in there is, you can't always control your thoughts. Some thoughts just pop into mind. So an initial worry might just pop into. You didn't decide to start worrying about sleep, right? So the thought popped into your mind, oh my God, what if I don't sleep tonight? But then in the blink of an eye, you're also thinking, you're elaborating on it. You're going, oh yeah, like then, I'm only gonna get 3 hours of sleep tonight. And then like tomorrow, I'm gonna feel awful tomorrow. And I'm gonna have a terrible day at work, and I'm gonna be super frustrated. I'm gonna end up yelling at the kids and like blah, 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 all this stuff. Everything after that initial worry is under your control. And with practice, you can get better at letting that stuff go. And when you do, you're going to drastically reduce the overall amount of emotion you feel as a result. So one worry that pops into your head, yeah, you're going to feel a little bit anxious, right? But if you leave it there and don't throw more fuel on the flame, so to speak, by continuing to elaborate on the worries, it's going to be so much more manageable than if you sit there for 5 minutes stewing and worrying and elaborating on that initial worry. Then you're going to be overwhelmed with anxiety. And like, I don't care what kind of techniques you have, like you're just going to have to wait for that to kind of burn out. Once anxiety gets that, or any kind of emotion gets that big, like it's just gonna take time to kind of burn out. So the real trick is catching it early. And when I say catching it, I don't mean catching the emotion. I mean catching the thoughts that are generating the emotion and letting them go.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
That's why it's really important to distinguish between the thought and the emotion that the thought is generating. And it's all about control. You can't control the emotion. You can, to a large extent, control the thought. So this applies to worry and anxiety, but it applies to something like rumination, which is a form of thinking, and sadness or anger. So rumination often leads to those, right? So anyway, it's just really important in your mind to keep those things, to have a sharp distinction between those things. Hopefully that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think not to get like too philosophical in the whole like free will and control, what we can control, not control. Like the way I see things is something like exactly like you said, when we quickly identify this worry thought that often has like a whole like cascade of things that happen next that are unpleasant, just like being aware of like, oh, I'm not going to sleep tonight. Oh, I thought I caught that. I saw that thought like immediately. Often that automatically leads to kind of like the cascade, falling away, if you will. So in a way, it's almost like it's not that you can control what thought comes next, but just by being aware of it, that automatically leads to change. Something like that. Like, does it make sense to you?
Totally. I think it's the best way to really think about it probably is that you can always control your attention, like what you choose. Are you looking at this thought like from a third person perspective and with a lot of kind of compassion and with a wide angle, or are you in it kind of stewing on it, right? Or are you choosing to completely redirect your attention to something else, to the TV show you're watching or the conversation you're having or whatever it is, right? In terms of your thinking itself, it's a little muddy. I mean, you can, if you're in the middle of like worrying about not sleeping and then all of a sudden your fire alarm goes off, like I guarantee it, like your thinking is going to shift, right? You're going to start thinking about other things. So your thinking can change. But yeah, to your point, I think the kind of more sophisticated way of looking at this is that you always can control your attention, what you choose to focus on or not, and that your thinking tends to follow from that.
Well said. By the way, Nick, before we go to like number 5 here, you said something in passing, like you said when I used to take care of patients with insomnia, you're no longer doing that?
No, so I'm about a year and a half ago, I left my clinical practice to join a startup doing business consulting in sort of the culture and well-being space. So I continue to blog and write and teach and all that kind of stuff online. But yeah, I kind of took a break from the clinical work to.
That's so funny. I had no idea, but we should.
Oh, have I not told you about that? That's
no. Let's go on a detour here and what are you doing now?
Yeah, so I work with a startup again, and we do, a big problem these days has been, culture and employee well-being and retention and this sort of thing. You can at some point it's not about the money anymore, but like people decide to work or not work at a place because of other factors and like what kind of culture is it and like how seriously does a place prioritize the well-being of its people? Like that becomes really important. And so there's a lot of companies that are sort of realizing that and but they don't have expertise in how to do that. And so looking for solutions to help them build healthier cultures and sort of prioritize the well-being of their people. And so, there's this company I joined and they wanted a psychologist on board, someone with kind of a clinical and research background for a variety of reasons to help. And so, yeah, I sort of took the leap into something pretty different from what I had been doing, but it just seemed like a cool opportunity. And it's one of the cool things about clinical work is you can always go back to it, right? It's I don't think the demand for what we're doing is going down anytime soon. So, so that's what I've been up to for the last year and a half or so.
Congratulations. Really excited to hear that. And very, very nice. Well, after that detour, we're 30 minutes in. So let's actually, we have a couple of left, but I think we only have time probably to do one more.
Sure.
So let me read them to you. And sorry. I'll have you pick which is your favorite, which is going to be pay attention to how your emotions feel physically, validate your emotions without judgment, accept your emotions, control your behavior, or be compassionate with other people's emotions. Which one do you want to talk about?
Hmm. Um, maybe that 7, they accept their emotions and control their behavior, because this is another, we sort of talked a little bit about validating emotions instead of being judgmental of them, and so we could excuse me, we talked about that one already, but another really, so we've also talked about the emotions themselves, right? And then we've talked about the sort of thought patterns that lead to emotions, right? Like worry leading to anxiety. But this one, I like this one because it brings in this third really important element, which is our behavior, right? So you have a thought, you feel an emotion. And one of the ways so one way of thinking about emotions are they're like messengers. They're sort of like sending us a message. But the other sort of metaphor for what emotions do is they're like nudges. They like nudge us in certain directions behaviorally, right? So if you if you feel afraid, the behavioral nudge is usually to like retreat, to not do something, to kind of sink in. On the other hand, if you feel angry, you're usually primed toward some kind of aggression, right? Whether or action, right? To do something. And so emotions are like, one way you can think about them is they're like behavioral heuristics. They're like kind of, all right, generally you're afraid, so like do this, like run away. We don't know exactly what you should do, but like this thing looks dangerous, so get out of there. That's probably a good idea. So this distinction between, or the rule here is sort of accept your emotions, control your behavior. And this comes down to, again, controllability. Like what do you actually have control over with your experience? And as we said, you can't directly do anything about your emotions, but you can do something about your behavior, what you choose to do. So the problem I see a lot of people get into is because the emotion is the thing that hurts, that they want to take care of, all their energy and focus goes to the emotion. The problem is opportunity costs, right? If you're putting all your time and attention into the emotion, which you can't actually do anything about, that's all time and attention you couldn't be putting changing something you can actually change, right? Like your behavior or your attention and your focus and your way of thinking, right? So I think that's where, and we could get into a lot of different specifics with this, but it's, anytime you're just upset or you're having a hard time, one of the best things you can do is just think about these 3 buckets of experience. You have the emotion itself, which you can't really control. You have the thoughts that are generating the emotion, and you do have a pretty good amount of control over. And then you have your behavior, what you choose to do or not. And remember, not choosing to do anything is a decision, right? Or choosing to keep doing the same thing, to stay stuck in the same mental loop, that's a decision, right? And it's going to have consequences. Just like choosing to say, you know what, I feel anxious right now, that's a bummer, but I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to keep watching the show I'm watching, or whatever it is. So it's important to not get overly stuck and fixated on the emotion, even though it's understandable because it's the thing that hurts, that we feel. But it's always important to remember you have so many options behaviorally in terms of what you can do, right? And this comes up with insomnia, specifically when people say like, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was just anxious and I couldn't go back to sleep, right?
Yeah.
So you're laying there, it's dark, right? You're tired, you're exhausted. And what do? Well, generally it's you're like spinning your wheels thinking, or you're just kind of stuck in the emotion, that like fear or the frustration or whatever it is. And we kind of forget, there is this other option. Like you could get out of bed, right? You could pull up a book on your Kindle and read a little bit. You could even, God forbid, you could turn the TV on. I know it's like heresy, in the insomnia world that you would like watch TV in bed. But here's the thing. Watching TV in bed, while maybe not ideal, you know what? It's a lot better than worrying about not sleeping and making yourself more and more and more anxious and frustrated. So the point, I'm not saying that's the solution to everything, but you have options if you remember, right, that you can't actually do anything about the emotion, but you can you have a lot of options with your behavior if you're willing to kind of take a step back and actually look at that and sort of appreciate that. So I think that's just, it's important to kind of remind ourselves of on a regular basis.
Very nicely put. And you already contextualized it so nicely. So, super nicely put. I have nothing to add. One, the final thing I want to ask you about here is like I was going to I was planning to ask you about your hair, because at some point you had like really long hair, right? What happened? What happened to that?
I chopped it off. I just got tired of
Yeah.
it. Yeah, I had been growing out for a few years, and it was pretty long. But you know, it was time for a
It's
change.
fine. All right. Very, very cool. Well, Nick, it was so nice to connect with you again. Hope to have you back soon again, and good luck with your new venture.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Bye bye.